Welcome back to UK Property Info. Today I need to explain something that has been puzzling even experienced property analysts for the past several months. The UK rental market is tightening, but not in the way we have seen before. The traditional patterns that have governed rental markets for decades are breaking down and something entirely new is emerging in their place. If you are a tenant trying to understand why the market feels so impossible, or a landlord wondering why the dynamics have shifted so dramatically, or simply someone trying to make sense of the UK housing situation, this video will give you clarity that you will not find anywhere else. Before I dive into this analysis, if you find this kind of honest property insight valuable, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. I am trying to grow this community of informed property watchers, and every subscription genuinely helps. Now let me explain what is actually happening in the UK rental market and why it feels so different from anything we have experienced before. To understand why the current tightening is new, we first need to understand how rental markets traditionally tighten. In a normal cycle, tightening happens when demand outstrips supply. More people want to rent than there are properties available. This creates competition, pushes up rents, and eventually the market corrects itself. Higher rents attract more investors, more properties come onto the market, and equilibrium is restored. This is the textbook model that has governed rental markets for generations. When I started analysing property markets 15 years ago, this was the framework everyone used. Demand up, prices up, supply responds, market balances, simple, predictable, cyclical. But what is happening now does not fit this model at all. We are seeing something that defies the traditional understanding of how rental markets work, and the implications are profound for everyone involved in housing. The new tightening is characterised by simultaneous pressure from both sides of the market in ways that do not resolve themselves through normal mechanisms. On the supply side, we have an unprecedented exodus of landlords that is permanently removing properties from the rental sector. On the demand side, we have a strange phenomenon where official demand metrics are falling, even as actual housing need intensifies. These two dynamics are interacting in ways that create a completely different type of market pressure. It is not simply too many tenants chasing too few properties. It is a fundamental restructuring of how the rental market operates. The old rules about supply responding to demand, about price signals creating equilibrium, about market forces self-correcting, none of these apply in the current environment. We are in genuinely uncharted territory, and most commentary I see completely fails to grasp this. Let me explain the supply side first, because this is where the most dramatic change is occurring. Over the past 3 years, the UK rental sector has lost somewhere between 250,000 and 350,000 properties. These are not properties that have temporarily left the market. They are properties that have been sold by landlords to owner-occupiers and have permanently exited the rental sector. The landlords who sold are not coming back. The properties they sold are no longer available to rent. This is a structural reduction in rental housing stock that cannot be reversed by normal market mechanisms. In previous downturns, when conditions improved, landlords returned to the market and supply recovered. But the current exodus is different. The landlords leaving now are not responding to temporary market conditions. They are responding to fundamental changes in the economics and regulation of rental property that make the entire business model unviable for many individual investors. The factors driving landlord exits are structural rather than cyclical. Section 24. Tax changes have eliminated mortgage interest relief, meaning landlords now pay tax on turnover rather than profit. For highly leveraged landlords, this creates effective tax rates exceeding 100% of actual income. Interest rates have risen from near zero to over 5%, tripling or quadrupling mortgage payments for those on variable rates or coming off fixed deals. Regulatory requirements have multiplied, with electrical safety certificates, gas safety certificates, energy performance requirements, deposit protection, right-to-rent checks, and in some areas selective licensing schemes adding thousands of pounds to annual operating costs. The Renters Reform Bill threatens to abolish Section 21, no-fault evictions, removing landlords' ability to regain possession of their own properties reliably. Each of these factors alone might be manageable. Combined, they create conditions where many landlords simply cannot operate profitably. selling becomes the only rational choice. The critical point about supply reduction is that it is not responding to price signals. In a normal market, rising rents would attract new investment. Landlords would see higher yields and enter the market, increasing supply. But new landlord purchases have collapsed to their lowest levels in over a decade. The number of buy-to-let mortgages being taken out has fallen by over 60% from peak levels. New investors look at the combination of high interest rates, tax disadvantages, regulatory burden, and political hostility, and conclude that residential rental property is simply not an attractive investment. The landlords who remain are older, often have owned their properties for decades, and many are actively planning their own exits. There is no pipeline of replacement landlords waiting to enter. The supply reduction we have already seen is likely to continue and potentially accelerate in coming years. This is not a temporary shortage that will self-correct. It is a structural contraction that will persist until policy fundamentally changes. Now let me explain the demand side, which is where the new dynamic becomes really interesting and counterintuitive. If you look at official metrics, rental demand appears to be softening. Inquiries to letting agents are down. Properties are taking slightly longer to let in some areas. The frenzy of dozens of applicants for every property has eased somewhat. Commentators looking at these statistics conclude that the rental crisis is easing, that supply and demand are coming back into balance, that the worst is over. But this interpretation completely misses what is actually happening. The reduction in measured demand does not represent reduced housing need. It represents demand destruction. People are not choosing to rent less because they have found alternatives. They are being forced out of the rental market entirely because they can no longer afford to participate. This is a crucial distinction that most analysis fails to make. Demand destruction takes many forms, all of them representing housing stress rather than housing satisfaction. Young adults who would normally be renting their own flats are staying with parents or returning to the family home because they cannot afford market rents. People are taking in lodgers or sharing with strangers, not through choice but through financial necessity. Couples who would prefer to live separately are moving in together prematurely because neither can afford to rent alone. Workers are commuting impossible distances because they have been priced out of areas near their employment. Some people are leaving cities entirely, relocating to cheaper regions, even when it means career sacrifices or separation from family and community. In extreme cases, people are leaving the country altogether, seeking more affordable housing markets abroad. None of these represent people whose housing needs have been met. All represent people whose housing needs have been suppressed by unaffordability. The new tightening is characterized by this dual pressure that does not resolve through normal mechanisms. Supply is contracting because landlords are exiting due to structural factors that are independent of demand conditions. Demand is contracting because tenants are being priced out and forced into suboptimal living situations. But these two contractions are not creating equilibrium. They are creating a market that is simultaneously dysfunctional for both landlords and tenants. Landlords face operating conditions that make profitable rental impossible. Tenants face rental costs that consume unsustainable proportions of income. The market is not finding balance. It is breaking down. The tightening we are experiencing is not the healthy tightening of a competitive market where price signals allocate resources efficiently. It is the pathological tightening of a market that is fundamentally malfunctioning. One way to understand the new dynamic is to think about what happens to the people who are pushed out of each segment of the market. When landlords exit, their properties are typically sold to owner-occupiers. This removes housing from the rental sector, but adds it to the owner-occupied sector. In theory, this should reduce demand for rentals as some tenants become homeowners, but the tenants who buy are typically the most affluent, those with deposits saved and income sufficient for mortgage approval. They were often the best tenants, paying rent reliably and maintaining properties well. Their departure leaves behind a tenant pool that is on average less affluent and more financially stressed. Meanwhile, the properties that remain in the rental sector are increasingly owned by landlords who have survived the exodus precisely because they are most commercially focused on maximising returns. They have less tolerance for rent arrears, stricter tenant selection criteria, and greater willingness to push rents to market maximums. The result is a rental market that is simultaneously shrinking and becoming more expensive per remaining unit. Fewer properties available, but each remaining property extracting maximum possible rent from increasingly stressed tenants. This is not healthy competition. It is a market in distress. The tenants who remain in the shrinking pool are paying higher proportions of income on rent, have less security of tenure, and face greater risk of displacement. The landlords who remain are operating with thinner margins, greater regulatory burden, and increasing political hostility. Neither side is thriving. Both are struggling. The market is tightening in a way that creates losers on all sides. This is fundamentally different from traditional market tightening, where rising prices benefit one side while signalling to the other side that adjustment is needed. The regional dimension of the new tightening is also distinct from previous patterns. In traditional market cycles, rental pressure concentrated in London and the southeast, with cheaper regions acting as pressure valves. Workers priced out of London could move to Birmingham, or Manchester, or Leeds, and find affordable rental accommodation. This geographic mobility helped markets adjust, spreading demand more evenly and preventing extreme localised pressure. But the current supply contraction is happening everywhere. Landlord exits are not confined to expensive areas. They are occurring across the entire country as the structural factors driving exits, tax changes, interest rates, regulations apply nationally. There is no longer a cheap region to escape to. Manchester rents have risen faster than London in percentage terms. Leeds, Bristol, Nottingham, all have experienced dramatic rent increases and supply contractions. The pressure valves that previously helped markets adjust have themselves come under pressure. Scotland and Wales present their own variations on the theme, but ultimately demonstrate the same underlying dynamic. Scotland's rent controls, introduced to protect tenants, have accelerated landlord exits as the ability to increase rents to cover rising costs has been constrained. Welsh licensing schemes have added administrative burden that has prompted additional landlords to sell. Policies designed to help tenants have contributed to supply reduction that ultimately harms tenants through reduced choice and availability. This is the cruel paradox of the current situation. Interventions intended to make renting more affordable or secure are contributing to supply destruction that makes renting less available. The new tightening's partly policy-induced, though this does not mean the policies themselves were wrong, merely that their interaction with other factors has produced unintended consequences. Understanding the new tightening matters because it determines what responses are appropriate. If this were traditional market tightening, the solution would be straightforward. Build more housing, incentivize new rental supply, and wait for market forces to restore equilibrium. But that prescription does not address the structural factors driving current dynamics. Building more housing helps, but only if that housing enters the rental sector, and current conditions actively discourage rental investment. Incentivizing supply only works if the incentives outweigh the disincentives, and current disincentives are substantial and growing. Waiting for market forces assumes markets are functioning, but the current market is fundamentally dysfunctional. The new tightening requires new thinking about solutions. For tenants navigating the new market, the practical implications are significant. If you currently have a stable tenancy with a reasonable landlord at manageable rent, protecting that tenancy should be your absolute priority. The replacement market is worse than it has ever been, and any disruption to your current arrangement carries significant risk. Do not assume you can easily find equivalent accommodation. Do not take your current landlord for granted. Communicate proactively, pay rent reliably, maintain the property well, and demonstrate that you are a tenant worth keeping. If you are searching for rental accommodation, understand that competition remains intense even if headline metrics suggest softening. Be prepared to move quickly, have documentation ready, offer references proactively, and consider flexibility on location or property type. The tenants who succeed in the current market are those who present themselves as the lowest risk option for landlords facing an environment where problem tenancies are increasingly costly to resolve. For landlords still in the market, the new dynamic requires honest assessment of your position and prospects. If your property is highly leveraged, on a variable rate or approaching fixed rate expiry, and in an area with challenging tenant demographics, the mathematics may genuinely not work. Emotional attachment to property investment should not override financial reality. Some landlords need to exit, and recognizing this early allows for orderly sale rather than forced disposal. For landlords with stronger positions, lower leverage, good properties in strong locations, quality tenant relationships, the environment is challenging but survivable. Rent increases are possible and often necessary to cover increased costs, but should be approached sensitively with existing tenants. Losing a good tenant to chase marginal rent increases often proves false economy when void periods and remarketing costs are factored in. The landlords who thrive in the new market will be those who operate professionally, maintain properties well, and build relationships that encourage tenant longevity. For policymakers, the new tightening presents profound challenges. The rental sector has contracted significantly and shows no signs of natural recovery. Policies intended to improve tenant welfare have contributed to supply reduction that harms tenant interests. The private rented sector houses over 11 million people and cannot simply be allowed to shrink indefinitely without alternative provision. Yet the political discourse around rental property remains largely hostile, focused on tenant protections that may further accelerate landlord exits rather than supply measures that would address the fundamental shortage. The gap between political rhetoric and market reality has rarely been wider. Meaningful policy response would require acknowledging that landlords provide essential housing services and that conditions making rental investment unviable ultimately harm the tenants those policies aim to protect. This acknowledgement seems unlikely in the current political environment. Looking forward, I see the new tightening continuing and likely intensifying. Nothing in the current policy trajectory addresses the structural factors driving landlord exits. Interest rates may fall somewhat, but are unlikely to return to near zero levels that characterized the previous decade. Tax disadvantages for rental property are now embedded in legislation with no prospect of reversal. Regulatory burden continues to increase with new requirements regularly proposed. Political hostility shows no sign of abating. The factors that have driven 300,000 properties out of the rental sector will continue driving more properties out. Meanwhile, demand destruction will continue as rents absorb ever higher proportions of tenant income and more people are pushed into suboptimal housing arrangements. The market will continue tightening in its new dysfunctional way. The most likely scenario is a rental market that becomes increasingly bifurcated. At the premium end, professional landlords with strong properties and desirable locations will continue operating, but at rent levels that exclude large portions of the population. At the lower end, quality and availability will deteriorate as properties that barely work economically are maintained to minimum standards or exit the sector entirely. The middle market, decent properties at affordable rents for average workers, will continue shrinking as the economics of this segment become unviable. We are moving toward a rental market that serves the affluent well, serves the poor through social housing where available, and fails the broad middle who earn too much for social housing, but too little for premium private rents. This is a profound shift from the rental market of even a decade ago. Let me summarise what we have covered about how the UK rental market is tightening in a new way. This is not traditional market tightening, where demand exceeds supply and price signals restore equilibrium. This is structural tightening, where supply is contracting due to factors independent of demand, where demand is being destroyed rather than satisfied, and where normal market mechanisms are failing to create balance. 300,000 properties have left the rental sector permanently, and more will follow. Measured demand has softened, but actual housing need has not reduced. Tenants are being pushed into suboptimal arrangements rather than finding satisfactory housing. Landlords remaining in the market face conditions that challenge profitability regardless of demand. The tightening affects all regions, with no cheap areas acting as pressure valves. Policy interventions have contributed to supply destruction through unintended consequences. The outlook is for continued tightening as structural factors persist and intensify. Those navigating the market, whether tenants seeking homes or landlords managing investments, need to understand these new dynamics to make informed decisions. Thank you for watching UK Property Info. I hope this analysis has helped you understand why the rental market feels so different from anything we have experienced before. Share this with anyone trying to make sense of UK rental conditions, and I will see you in the next video.